Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Tonight, the GFPD is very excited to host a webinar with attorney Amanda Hess. Amanda Hess is an attorney and equal access team leader for protection and advocacy for people with disabilities, P&A. She's worked representing people with disabilities regarding their legal rights. She's worked on disability discrimination matters, including special education, assistive technology, effective communication, housing, accessibility, and matters involving barriers to work. On a personal note, Amanda Hess has represented my own son that many of you know more than once in the last few years. This has provided her with the opportunity to have a greater understanding of the unique access and communication challenges that individuals with peroxisomal disorders and also combined vision and hearing losses typically face. In turn, I've learned so much from Amanda. She's provided guidance in how to leave the emotion, especially the frustration and anger parts of advocacy, at the door. Learning how to channel this emotion and put it into action in a productive way has been invaluable to me. It helped me to be a better advocate for my son and for others, and I'm really grateful that she's here tonight to share with all of you. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to please keep yourself muted. I believe I should have everyone but Amanda and I muted right now. But if for some reason you join and it doesn't mute you, if you could just make sure that you're staying muted to help everyone out with reducing background noise so that we can clearly hear Amanda sharing with everyone tonight. We will also be taking comments and questions to the chat box or email throughout the entire presentation. Feel free at any time. If you have a question and it pops up, go ahead and type it in there and we'll make sure to save and follow up with that afterwards. And if you're listening in tonight and you're not able to see the slides and you would, I will try to keep an eye out. You can still email me and I can send you those slides at katie@thegfpd.org. And again, I'm really glad that all of you have joined us tonight. And Amanda, thank you for being here. And you can go ahead and tell me when to, I'm going to be doing her slides. So if I step behind, she's going to let me know to go ahead and move along for her. So hopefully I won't mess that up for her. So
well, you'll be great. You'll be great. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the GFPD for the opportunity to speak with all of you today and share some of the advocacy tips that I've shared and I've found helpful in the work that I do. And so I just want to start off with a few notes. As Katie said, I'm located in South Carolina, and every state and U.S. territory is going to have aspects of special education that are unique to where you live. So I strongly encourage you to educate yourself on your state rules and policies in this area and really learn about what resources you have available. And you'll hear me reiterate throughout this presentation. Also, given the time that we have, I'm just giving you a very general overview. I'm not going to be going into detailed specifics, but certainly if you have a question, as Katie said, just type it up or let her know. And due to the state-specific nature of this area, and I think just the time that we have tonight, I'm not going to be taking any questions during this webinar, but if you do have questions, please type them in. Please let Katie know. I'm going to have my email address on the last slide. Please feel free to reach out to me and we will follow up on those questions with you. All right, so if we can move to the next slide. So who am I? Well, you heard a little bit about me from Katie, and thank you so much for that amazing introduction. As she said, I'm an attorney. I'm licensed in New York and South Carolina, but I only practice in South Carolina with protection and advocacy for people with disabilities. And I've been with P&A for about 12 years. And one of the goals on the team that I work on is that students with disabilities should receive appropriate educational services in public school. Through that, I represented a number of students on all different types of educational issues: least restrictive environment, transition, free appropriate public education, effective communication, all types of issues. And I've also done outreach events and done trainings to students, guardians, and providers on different types of educational issues, including advocacy tips as well. So protection and advocacy in South Carolina, we're a nonprofit. We're mandated by South Carolina state law and US federal law to protect the rights of people with disabilities in South Carolina. And we're independent of all other agencies and entities that provide services to people with disabilities here. And P&A operates as South Carolina's protection and advocacy system. And I'm telling you a little bit more about protection and advocacy because I encourage you all to become familiar with the P&A system in your state. Some of them have different names like disability rights and the state name after it or another name, but every state is going to have something like us. And PNAs work to protect the rights of people with disabilities. And each state is going to have its own goals and priorities that it works on, but it's usually abuse and neglect and other disability-related services and legal problems. PNAs also can provide information and referral, and they usually have a lot of resources. Like on our website, we have a section of fact sheets on education specific to South Carolina. And I share this because I think knowing the resources in your state that you can turn to for help is a really helpful part of effective advocacy. So if you hadn't heard about PNAs before and you're interested in finding the protection advocacy system in your state, I've provided you a website here. If the slides haven't been shown, I've given Katie some handouts that can be shared with whoever would like them. All right, next slide. So the training goals for this training is just a general overview of IDEA, that's Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it's going to be a very general overview. IDEA is a large federal law with regulations, so I'm just going to be giving you a brief background to segue into learning about some helpful IDEA concepts. I think there are certain concepts of IDEA that are important to be aware of, especially when you're advocating in an IEP meeting. I think it's important for parents and students to know about these concepts in order to really understand the decisions that you're a part of, to have good input as part of parental participation. I can tell you, for instance, sometimes just knowing a term like least restrictive environment and mentioning that in an IEP meeting can really perk up district attendees and make you seem more knowledgeable too. So sometimes that can be helpful. I'm not going to go over all IDEA concepts, just some that have frequently come up in my work. And again, I'm only focusing on IDEA as the federal law. I'm not going to get into state-specific rules or policies. I'm going to share some general advocacy tips as well as advocacy tips for IEP meetings that I have found helpful in sharing before to help prepare for the meetings, at the meeting, and then tips if there's still some lingering concerns after meetings. And then finally, I have a couple of slides of resources. So we go to the next slide. So very generally, disability rights at school. So children with disabilities are protected by federal laws. IDEA is the one that we're going to talk about today. And this is the federal statute that guarantees an IEP eligible student a free, appropriate public education. And very generally, it goes over eligibility for IEPs, the process of developing an IEP, dispute resolution, and a number of other things. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is a federal law that generally states that entities that get federal funding cannot discriminate against individuals with disabilities. So all public schools get some form of federal funding, which would make Section 504 applicable to them. And our U.S. Department of Education has promulgated regulations under Section 504 regarding students with disabilities. So sometimes you'll hear the term 504 plan, and that's really where that's going to come from. So for an example, a student that just needs accommodations in a school setting, but not special education services, that's the type of student that Section 504 and a 504 plan would apply to. And the last one's Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's also known as the ADA. And that's a federal law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Now, there are different titles of the ADA, and Title II applies to state and local governments and their departments, and that includes public schools. And this would apply to all their programs, activities, services, all the things that they do. So for instance, if students with disabilities were excluded from field trips, then Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act might apply to that situation. And again, just to reiterate, there may also be laws and regulations that are specific to your state and U.S. territory that can apply to students with disabilities at school. So those are something that you might want to look into where you're located. All right, next slide. So this is a very general overview of IDEA. It is a federal and state program, and it leaves room for states to have rules and policies as well. So there can be some nuances in states. So for instance, South Carolina has regulations regarding when the age 21 cutoff is, and some states may be different with regards to that age as well. In South Carolina, we also provide that transition services are going to start earlier than IDEA provides. In South Carolina, we also have guidance on the 13 types of disabilities in determining eligibility for an IEP. So that's some of the ways that states can become more nuanced regarding IDEA. IDEA also provides a process to develop a plan to educate each eligible child, and it's going to provide for individualized services, and that's generally in the student's IEP. The goal is consensus between parents and school districts, but I think for anyone out there who has been involved in an IEP meeting or had an IEP, that doesn't always happen, and that's primarily when people are coming to look for help from us. It also provides for dispute resolution options when consensus is not reached at those meetings. Next slide. So the first section that we're going to talk about is helpful IDEA concepts. And the next slide that Katie's going to go to is going to share some of these concepts. So the ones that we're going to go over today, and again, these are just a few, it certainly isn't everything that's included in IDEA, but some of the ones that come up in my work are parent participation, free appropriate public education, that's also known as FAPE, least restrictive environment and placement, supplementary aids and services, assisted technology, transition, and prior written notice. All right, so the first one we're going to go to on the next slide is parent participation. And it is so important for parents to know about their rights to participate in the IEP process. So IDEA outlines the required members of the IEP team, the minimum, and parents are one of the required members. And districts need to notify parents early enough to schedule meetings at an agreed upon time and place. So school districts have to take steps to ensure parent participation at IEP meetings, or that parents are given the opportunity to participate. So that means they've got to schedule meetings at a mutually agreed upon time and place. So if a district were to contact a parent and say, we are only holding this meeting next Thursday at 2 o'clock, make it if you can, that's not appropriate under IDEA. If you had a medical appointment or another meeting, or you had to work, they should be working with you to schedule that meeting at a time that works for both parties. Do not ignore meeting requests. So I can tell you in my experiences, a district will usually take different methods to try to contact a parent to offer participation in the IEP meeting. They usually keep track of that on a chart. So it might be sending home a notice with the student, emailing a parent, calling a parent, sending it by mail, and they'll document all that. Don't ignore these requests. A district might go ahead and have a meeting if there's no response after the district has made attempts to contact you. And the concern is then they can make decisions at that meeting without you. I think it's important for parents to know that you can also request special review meetings, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later. So if you felt there was an issue that you wanted to talk about, you can certainly request a meeting from the district. And while I prefer meeting in person, I think it really gives you an opportunity to read the members of the team, especially when you're bringing up different interventions or proposed services. It enables a parent to ask direct questions. For instance, if you see a team member that you think might help provide some helpful information, something that you're trying to advocate for instance, a service, you will be there to maybe ask them more direct questions than you could do through other methods. But if you're not able to meet in person, the district should offer other methods for parents to participate, such as calling into a meeting. Districts also need to ensure that parents understand IEP meetings. That includes arranging for an interpreter. So if a parent's primary language is Spanish or American Sign Language, they should be arranging for a qualified interpreter during that meeting so the parent can understand it. Parents should also be provided with notice of meetings. That's going to include the purpose of the meeting, the time, location, and who will be attending. I encourage you to read those notices. It's going to let you know what's going to be discussed at the meeting. For instance, are there going to be evaluations discussed? Is transition going to be discussed? Was there something that you had asked to be discussed that maybe isn't listed on there? You can follow up with the district to make sure that that area is going to be covered. I think one of the most important things about parent participation, and this is going to come up a couple times during this presentation, is asking questions. I can't encourage parents enough to ask questions during this process, to share input and concerns. Ask a question if you don't understand. That enables you to get information to help you provide good input into that team. For instance, I did not have a special education background. So for me, I come from a legal background, and while IDEA has a lot of detail in it, it really speaks to the process, it doesn't go into the substance, which makes a lot of sense because IDEA is individualized to the student's unique needs. So in my early meetings, I can remember teams going through all different types of evaluations and different results, things that I had never been exposed to today. And I asked a lot of questions during those meetings. What was the purpose of that evaluation? What does that result mean? How are you using that information to determine goals? How are you putting that into academic and functional needs? Don't be afraid to ask questions at these meetings. By doing that, it helps you understand what things mean. It helps you be part of that planning process. And I think this can really help with providing your input into proposals and decisions that are being made. For instance, let's say a district is proposing a certain placement. Ask to see if you can go visit that school so you can provide good input into it. Ask questions. Who's the teacher in that classroom? What's the makeup of that classroom? How many opportunities are there going to be for exposure to general ed peers, things of those nature? That way you can really explain your position on what that would be. And sharing input and concerns. And I think, you know, the timing of it is maybe a strategy, but in my experiences is the district isn't aware of the concerns, then they're not going to be able to have the opportunity to respond to that. So definitely raise concerns and questions if you have them. And finally, being aware of predetermination by the district versus considering parental input. So district drafts and suggestions are okay as long as they're not concrete and they're up for discussion. Discussion means considering parental input and suggestions. So for example, suppose there's an IEP meeting and a district goes to the table and says, we're going to place your student at X location and doesn't take any input. That looks a lot like predetermination. But if you're in an IEP meeting and a school district says, we're proposing placing student at X placement and it's up for discussion, a parent's able to provide input, they get feedback from the team. Even if the district says we're still going to place student at X, there's been the opportunity for input and discussion, and that really doesn't look like predetermination in that instance. Next slide.
I'm just going to pop in and add that I've had that happen a few times. And one of the things that I have had to do is go around to each person, each team member, and ask them for their input. Sometimes you may have a few team members that aren't speaking up, and it doesn't hurt as the parent to ask individually how they feel about this proposal.
Absolutely. And that really goes back to, I think it's really helpful when you can, to the extent that you can be there in person, to try to attend these meetings. All right, so we are going to get to the fun section on free appropriate public education, FAPE. So for background, at the beginning of IDEA, there's a number of purposes of this statute. And I pulled this quote. It's to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So FAPE is a term that you frequently hear in this process, and I think it's an important concept for parents to be aware of, because you'll often hear all students with IEPs are entitled to a FAPE, but what does that mean? So we're going to start learning about that on the next slide. So FAPE is an entitlement for all students who are eligible for an IEP. It means services are provided at no cost. It's going to be special education and related services. And it's going to be individualized services in the IEP. So the substance is up to the IEP team based on the student's unique needs. The goal is that if procedures are followed under IDEA, then an appropriate IEP should be created that's offering FAPE to a student. And there have been court cases that have analyzed FAPE. So I'm going to talk about a couple of Supreme Court cases, two important cases, the two cases that have been discussed. And the Supreme Court, that's the highest court in the United States. And these two cases really talked about what does an appropriate education mean for a student with IEP. So I'm just going to give you a very general overview of these two cases because we could probably spend a whole session just on them. So we're going to go to the first case on the next slide. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Rowley case. And this was a case that was decided in 1982, so some time ago. Amy Rowley, she was a first grade student in regular education classes, and she is an individual who is deaf. Her parents requested a sign language interpreter in all of her classes. And she had had an interpreter for a period of time, but it was reported the service wasn't necessary. Now, she was performing better than the average student, and she was easily advancing her grades. So the student, the parents eventually had this case go to the Supreme Court. And the question was it impacting her free, appropriate public education? So really, what does appropriate mean? So the Supreme Court reviewed this. And one of the areas that was discussed is the IEP developed under IDEA reasonably calculated to enable the child to receive educational benefits. So that's the first section. Is it reasonably calculated? Is the child going to receive educational benefits under this IEP? An IEP that is reasonably calculated for the child to achieve, an IEP that is reasonably calculated for the child to achieve passing grades and advanced grades generally. So for a student in regular education classes, advancing from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for the student. And really what this case said is the system's going to monitor the progress. So is that student passing their exams? Are they getting appropriate grades? Is there advancement from grade to grade? Is there progress on the goals? And if you've got all this information and they are, then that's showing that that IEP is likely giving an appropriate educational benefit. But the Supreme Court said this is also a flexible rule. Not every student that's advancing from grade to grade may be getting a FAPE. Now, the important thing is this court limited its decision to this case. So we really didn't know what educational benefit meant in other types of matters, which brings us to the next slide in a recent decision that some of you may have heard of called Andrew F. So after Rowley, the case we were just talking about, courts were trying to determine educational benefit. And unfortunately, there was not agreement among them. So Andrew F. is another matter that went to the Supreme Court. And just some background about Andrew, he was a student with autism and ADHD. His disabilities affected his cognitive functioning, language, reading, social, and adaptive functioning. He had an IEP from preschool to fourth grade. After fourth grade, his parents became concerned that he was not making progress in the public school system. His IEPs had carried over similar goals and similar objectives year after year. He had behaviors that were impacting his education. So after fourth grade, his parents rejected the proposed IEP and ended up enrolling him in a private school, and he progressed in that school. And so the parents sued for reimbursement, and that's the case that eventually went to the Supreme Court. Before it went to the Supreme Court, though, it went to the 10th Circuit. And the 10th Circuit Court found that the educational benefit a student was entitled to, and this is shocking to me, of course, in the field that I'm in, that the educational benefit was merely more than de minimis. And so Andrew, he'd been making minimal progress, and that was more than de minimis. So you can see where this would be concerning, especially for those of us who advocate for students. So this went to the Supreme Court, and thank goodness the court did not agree with the de minimis standard for an educational benefit. It noted that the standard was markedly more demanding than de minimis. So Andrew F. said an IEP is reasonably calculated to make appropriate progress in light of the child's circumstances. So we're looking at the circumstances of the child and looking at what's appropriate given those circumstances. And I think this is especially important, the next bullet, the chance to meet challenging objectives. This is definitely better than the de minimis standard of that 10th Circuit. So this really takes Rowley, the case that we just discussed that talked about educational benefit. Is the IEP reasonably calculated to enable the child to read educational benefits? And it really enhances that standard, okay? There is a wonderful quote from the Andrew F. case that I thought I'd share with you all. And this said, "When all is said and done, a student offered an educational program providing merely more than de minimis progress from year to year can hardly be seen to have offered an education at all. For children with disabilities, receiving instruction that aims so low would be tantamount to sitting idly awaiting the time when they were old enough to drop out. The IDEA demands more." And I think that's important to keep in mind. So how is all this FAPE information helpful to you? Well, great. We know educational benefit, it's more than de minimis. So if you have an IEP and you've had repeated goals, minimal progress, bring that to the IEP team at an IEP meeting and discuss that. That needs to, I would strongly suggest that be reviewed. Review all the data, get progress notes, call a meeting if you see that progress has been stalled or the child isn't making any progress at all. Is the educational program, is that IEP tailored to the child's unique circumstances? Have there been appropriate evaluations and assessments? Are these services individualized to student? Are those goals appropriately ambitious for that student? But I also want you to keep all in mind, because this does come up with me. The IDEA, it does not provide for the best education. So you can't say, I want my child to have the best, because that's not what IDEA provides for. It provides for appropriate. Also, the IEP should be reasonably calculated. And so that's never a guarantee of an outcome or result in this. And we're going to talk about some advocacy tips later that may help provide more information about this. The last bullet point that provides a question and answer that I found from the U.S. Department of Ed website on NJRF. I encourage you all to review it so you got some time to do that. It goes into more detail about this area and it gives some helpful information for IEP teams to consider. So that's a way to kind of go beyond this. All right, next slide. The next slide we're going to talk about is least restrictive environment, and that's also known as LRE. So LRE, it's a presumption, it's not a mandate. And what it says is that students with IEP should be educated to the maximum extent appropriate with their non-disabled peers. So part of this is considering the full range of supplementary aids and services, and we're going to talk in a couple slides about what that means. Separate classes, schooling, and removal from regular education students should really only occur if the nature of the severity of the disability is such that being educated in a regular ed classroom with supplementary aids and services just can't be achieved. And so I think the key is to look into these, are there any other services that should be provided before a more restrictive environment is determined by the team. It is an individualized determination by the IEP team. There has to be a consideration of alternative placements, and it includes non-academic and extracurricular services. So I think keys to look into. A lot of my cases are about students with behaviors and inappropriate responses to behaviors. And so oftentimes I may get a case where a student's been put into an abbreviated day or restrictive placement. And part of our advocacy is asking, did you have appropriate behavioral accommodations? Was there a functional behavioral assessment? Was there a behavioral intervention plan in place that was appropriate to really determine whether a restrictive placement is appropriate or not? Next slide. So LRE kind of moves right into placement, and placement is made by a group of persons. That's going to include their parent. In my experiences, most often this is the IEP team determining this. It's made in conformity with the least restrictive environment provisions. It should be determined at least annually, and it's going to be based on the IEP. And it should be as close as possible to the child's home, so typically the zone school, unless another location is needed. So for instance, suppose there's an appropriate program at a different school. So that's when you'd consider utilizing a different school or location for placement. And on the next slide, we're just going to continue with this. A student should not be removed because of any needed modifications. That also goes to supplementary aids and services. The team should be considering any potential harmful effect on the student or on the quality of the student's services. And teacher selection and location usually is decided by the district. There may be some unique circumstances where a location may be put on the IEP, but typically that's a district decision. And just so you all know, you'll notice on some of these slides, you'll see that I put a citation to the regulations, but that's what that 34 CFR 300.114 through 117. CFR is Code of Federal Regulations, and that's where you can find that section.
So Sprago, if you have this book, which most parents do, you can look it right up.
Yes. I actually went to a rights law training a couple of years ago, and he was great about going through all those. So we just talked about supplementary aids and services in relation to least restrictive environment, and that's what this slide talks about. So these are going to be aids, services, and other supports that enable a child with a disability to be educated to the maximum extent appropriate with children without disabilities. So these should really be provided in any setting throughout the school that's going to be appropriate to that student. And this is a really, really broad area, but I just gave you some examples. It's really going to depend on the unique needs of the student, but it can include assistive technology. It can include training, and that would be training for students, parents, professionals. It can include a paraprofessional, preferential seating, large print materials, interpreters. So, and these are items that parents can raise in an IEP meeting. So sometimes you'll find a district may suggest supplementary aids and services, but parents can certainly raise them as well in an IEP meeting. And I just want to distinguish this between related services. I was talking with Katie earlier this week, and she mentioned transportation as an issue that often comes up. So a related service, that's a service to assist a student with a disability to benefit from special education. So that might be items like physical therapy, occupational therapy, and that also includes transportation. So if a student with an IEP needs transportation to benefit from their special education services, then an IEP team needs to address that. And if they're not addressing it and you feel it's a concern, a parent can raise that at IEP meetings as well. So not only is this going to include transportation, but also any needs as part of the transportation services. So any kind of accommodations for a bus, services and supports, like if an aid is needed for the bus, any kind of training needs, behavioral, medical, those types of things. And I've certainly been in meetings where we have raised transportation during them, and sometimes the school district will invite individuals from the transportation department, if they have one, to join the meeting, so all those decisions can be made. All right, next slide. So now we're going to talk about assistive technology, AT, and this, I think this area is a very important area. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about what an AT device is versus what an AT service is. So an AT device, it's going to be any item or product system that really increases the functional capabilities of an individual with a disability. So that includes increasing, maintaining, or improving them. So that's the device. The service is going to be any service that's going to assist in the selection, acquiring AT, or using the AT device. So that can include an evaluation of the student, getting the assistive technology, picking out which one's appropriate for a student, maintaining that or repairing it, training not only for the student, but for staff, family members if that AT is going to be going home, and coordinating the AT with any other services that that student's going to have. All right, on the next slide, we're going to continue talking about AT. So I think especially in special education, AT evaluations can really help determine assistive technology needs. So these are things that the district can bring up. Districts should be considering assistive technology, but these are also items that a parent can raise as well if you think there might be AT that could be out there. And AT is really broad. It can be something really low tech, like a pencil grip. It could be something as high tech, like an FM system, an augmented communication device, or a communication app. Some districts have AT specialists. I can tell you here in South Carolina, we've got some really, really big districts that have those positions. We've also got some extremely rural school districts where the special ed director wears a number of hats. That's just going to vary according to the district, but that's something I always inquire into, is if a district has an AT specialist or someone who does AT, if it's an AT matter that I'm working on. Also in South Carolina, our South Carolina Department of Ed's Office of Special Education Services has what they call AT regional specialists, and these are individuals that are available to help school districts with assistive technology. If the IEP team determines that AT is needed, then it does have to be addressed in the IEP. It should be noted on the IEP. There should also be details in the IEP as far as how it's going to be used, when it's going to be used, if training is necessary on it. So that should be detailed. If it's going to be needed at home or not. So for instance, if a student has homework or communication and there's a connection to the home for that device, then addressing that need at home as well. AT may be funded through the school district, but it can also, parents can also be private. That's really a decision that the parent's going to make. AT, if it's decided that a student needs AT, then it should be provided through the school district. If it is a district device, though, the district's responsible for maintenance and repair, but it is the district's device at the end of the day. All right, so we're gonna go to transition. Transition is services to prepare students for life after school. It's a very important service under IDA, so we're going to talk a little bit about it. But the IDA requires services to begin no later than the first IEP after the student turns 16. And this is an example of how states may vary. So in South Carolina, transition services begin with the first IEP in effect when a student turns 13. So we're a little bit earlier, so that may vary in your state as well. But the first step is determining post-secondary goals. So the first step is really gonna be assessing the student's needs to develop those goals. So they should be provided with age-appropriate assessments and evaluations, both informal, like interviewing the student, interviewing the parent, and formal assessments as well. And I just wanna add that there are also assessments based on the needs of the student. So for instance, if a student is nonverbal, then they should be providing picture assessments. Like I've seen picture assessments of pictures of different jobs. The student can point to that and what they're interested. It's really gonna be dependent on the student. And all this information should be discussed by the IEP team to develop appropriate, measurable post-secondary goals. And I say appropriate because make sure you're checking that section of the IEP. If I certainly have seen goals that weren't realistic for a student, I've seen parents who told me, I don't know where that goal came from. Like a student wanted to work as a clerk, let's say, and the parent said, I don't know where that interest came from. So those are things that can be raised as far as appropriate goals to the IEP team. And of course, as with anybody, this is a young, so it could vary. And that's, so that this can change as time goes on. Next slide.
Can I add real quick too, because I feel like we could have an entire webinar just on appropriate assessments, just that subject alone. But I just want to add in too, because I know that we have parents on here that have the combined vision and hearing loss, and communication is such a challenge for these individuals that, you know, something that I have said over the years that is pretty powerful statement when you're talking about having appropriate assessments is to ask the team, you know, how was this assessment done? And how did you have effective communication during that assessment? Because you really can't assess someone and collect data and set these goals if you don't have that effective communication in place. So I really feel like the one can't happen without the other.
Absolutely. So once the team has decided the post-secondary goals, and I don't want this to get confusing. So your post-secondary goals are going to be the goals for life after school. So that's a little bit different from the IEP up until now. So, and it's really going to vary depending on the student. So it might be post-secondary education, like college or tech schools. It may be employment. It may be a student living as independently as possible, like learning how to utilize transportation, budgeting. It may also be daily living school. So that's student learning cooking, learning how to dress themselves, learning how to feed themselves. It's really going to depend on the student. So once that post-secondary goal is decided and or goals, then it's determining what transition services are going to be needed to help prepare for that goal. So this is going to be a coordinated set of activities to help prepare that student for life after school. And really, it's going to be based on the student's needs, preferences, the interests. That really becomes the focus of the IEP. So that's going to include things like instruction, related services, community experiences, employment objectives, daily living skills, perhaps a functional vocational evaluation. And I really just want to highlight the importance of community experiences. It is one thing to talk about a post-secondary goal in the abstract, and it is quite another to see it in concrete and have that experience. So students can go out into the community and practice daily living skills. They can practice employment skills. And I think having these community experiences gives a lot of information for the IEP team to consider, the strengths, weaknesses, likes and dislikes. And it really, in my opinion, it's a safe place for a student to learn these skills and to be really pulling on this information. All right, next slide.
And I'm going to add again, I just in case anyone has a little one on here and they're thinking, this doesn't really apply to me, I don't need to hear this right now. Think about the goals that you have right now. I wish I would have done this. And you're constantly building upon these goals. I know at one point in middle school, early on in middle school, we were working, they were working on a goal with my son to cut with scissors. Why? You know, that may be appropriate for someone else, but it was not appropriate for my son. We were spending all this time and energy making no progress on something that, what was he going to do with this skill? So really think about the goals you have now, even if your child is 7 or 8 years old, and say, what are we building upon? What is this going to lead to? And are these appropriate right now?
Absolutely. And the next one is, and that's really, I think, lends itself into involving the student. Really getting that information to the student, so the student is really the focus of transition services. If the student can't attend the IEP meeting, the team just has to find other ways to ensure that their interests and preferences are discussed and considered. So one way, parental input into that, getting that information from the parent. All right, next slide. Transition also includes involving others who might be able to help with transition services. So that means inviting agencies with the consent of the parent or an adult student who may provide or pay for transition services. So every state is going to have a vocational rehabilitation department. Very generally, that's an agency that provides services to eligible individuals with disabilities when they're facing barriers to work or trying to get a job. You can certainly look up the VR in your state to get more information, or inviting an intellectual and developmental disabilities agency. And if the district fails, if the agency fails to do this, then an IEP meeting should be reconvened to determine other ways to meet those transition objectives. All right, the next slide, this is going to be the last slide talking about IDA concepts, and this is prior written notice. This is an extremely important document that is required by IDEA. The school district must provide this to parents before changing or refusing identification, evaluation, placement, or FAPE. It should outline the IDA outlines the content of the notice, and this notice is going to conclude a description of what was proposed or refused at that meeting. It should give an explanation of the result or outcome. It should include the information that was used for that decision, any other options that were considered, and relevant factors. It should be in understandable language to parents, and it should also include resources for parents. For instance, protection and advocacy, at least in South Carolina, is usually included on that. If you are not getting prior written notice after meetings, make sure that you request that from the school district. They should be providing it, but if you don't get it, ask for it. All right, so we're going to move into some general advocacy tips now.
Can I just emphasize this one document? Sorry, another time. This is a document that I find a lot when I'm working with other families in my state, out of my state. They don't know about this document, so I really just want to emphasize. I know it's one slide and it's about to jump into some tips. This is a really important document that I'm really shocked at how many people, including myself years ago, didn't know about this document, and the school was not providing it, and they are required to. If you are asking to add something, change something, if the school district is, this document should always be happening. It should be filled out. You should have a copy of it. If you're requesting something and they're denying it, this document should exist, and you should be getting a copy of it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This is a really great way to have something in writing and document. I asked for this and it was denied, and this was the reason why. Or maybe they asked for this and we discussed it and we decided not to do this. Whatever it may be, this is your documentation, and it's required by law.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to first talk about some general advocacy tips, and those are going to be on the next slide. So this is something that we often use at P&A. It's the use of the 4 Ps: preparation, politeness, patience, and persistence. So politeness, and I'm sure you all have heard this before, but I'm going to hammer it home again. I can't emphasize enough the importance of politeness. Please and thank you is going to get you a long way. From the standpoint of advocacy, politeness is a strategy. You're going to get a lot further by trying to maintain the relationship between you and the district. Patience. Keep in mind that sometimes this can be a process that can take time. For instance, if a new intervention is being tried with a student, it may take a little bit of time to collect that data and bring that to the team to see if it's effective. And I think giving the process some time as well, so some patience. Persistence. If at first you don't succeed, try again. We've all heard that too. If you requested a service at a meeting and the district didn't agree, then consider, would bringing in more information be helpful? Would that be useful, more information and data? I worked on a matter involving a request for an intervener for a student who's deafblind, and we had multiple meetings about this need. This parent knew a ton of information about this need, had worked tirelessly trying to convince the IEP team. And it really took having subsequent meetings, she found an individual who's just an expert in this area. That person participated in our IEP meeting. They educated the team and really convinced this team that this student needed this. We were persistent in a very professional way, and it really paid off, and we didn't have to end up doing anything formal with that. Educate yourself is the next tip. I think an aspect of effective advocacy is preparation and educating yourself. Attending trainings like this to really be knowledgeable about IDEA and what your rights are under this law, I think is just key in being an effective advocate in this process. For those of you who didn't know least restrictive environment anymore, if they're proposing a more restrictive placement that's going to mean that your child's going to be away from their regular ed peers more often, you're going to know that term to bring it up and to raise that at IEP meetings. Being knowledgeable can be really helpful in making you an effective advocate. I think that also includes being knowledgeable about your child's disability. Some of my strongest parental advocates have really known a lot about their disability and how that impacts their child's education and brings that information to the team. And also being knowledgeable about resources that can help you, and we're going to talk about that too a little bit later. Be aware of your emotions, and I think this is another key one. A frequent conversation that I have had with many parents is, in this process, a parent really wears two hats. The parental hat, which is just by nature going to be an emotional hat. And you also wear an advocate hat, which is really focused on advocacy and strategy in this process. And when everything's going really well with the planning and the plan that's in place, it's really a lot easier to wear those two hats. But when things go downhill, it is really easy for the emotional hat to take over. And effective advocacy is also about recognizing this and how that impacts you and how that can affect you. And if it affects you in a way that may result in a breakdown of the process, I think coming up with techniques that can maintain effective advocacy and really keeping that at the forefront. So my first suggestion is do not interact with the district when you are upset. For instance, it is easy to send off a heated email when you're upset, but that's unlikely to be received well by the district, and it puts something in writing that you may not have meant. So for instance, let's say down the road you decided you wanted to do something more formal. Maybe you wanted to file a complaint. Maybe you wanted to file due process. Do you really want that email on the record? So those are things to consider. What I would suggest is write down notes about what occurred, but wait to communicate with the district until you're in a position that you're really going to think through the strategy of interacting with them and how you want to effectively respond. Sometimes just having another person that you feel comfortable with to review what you're going to write first. I often do that for parents. Parents often vent to me, and that's fine. I'm a safe person to vent to, and that's okay. We can kind of think through what happened. We can talk about what are good steps to take next. What's a good way to approach the issue? Another suggestion, take a break. Do something that's going to distract you until you're in a better position to really follow up on what your concerns are. And you're going to hear the same things when we talk about meetings in just a couple slides, IEP meetings. Maintaining documentation. This is really twofold. Maintaining special ed documents. And there's many ways of doing this that I've heard of. You just got to find the one that's effective for you. I've seen digital folders, binders, boxes. There's all different types of way, but I do strongly suggest that you maintain that. I know it's a lot of paperwork. I mean, just in limited time I'm involved in cases, I can amass files of paper. So I can't imagine what you all must be amassing in this process, but do that. Suppose you had a concern about repeated goals, lack of progress. You'll be able to really track that through the documentation that you maintain. And I think also keeping any important documentation, like important emails that you've shared with the district, with a teacher, where you're talking about services or concerns. So that part is maintaining documentation. I think the other part is also documenting for yourself. So for instance, documenting important conversations. If you had a conversation with the special ed director about a concern, you could follow up with an email to that special education director just confirming that. We're going to talk about that in another slide too, about a way to do that. But that way you're keeping that documentation for yourself as well. And I think finally, Look for help if you need it. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Again, we talked about states and protection and advocacy systems. Every state's also going to have what's the acronym PTI, because we can't have enough acronyms in this world. And that stands for Parent Training and Information Center. Every state's going to have a PTI. I believe they're funded through the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs. And this is a place where parents can get information in this area at no cost. For example, about special education rights. I think the services are going to vary, but in our state, in South Carolina, my state's PTI helps parents directly. Parents can call for help and information. It does trainings and outreach. They collaborate with us. So that can really be another resource for you. And on one of the resource slides, I've given you a couple of websites where you can look up the PTI in your state. And also look to see if there's any support groups too that could help you. All right, so we're now going to the last section, which is advocacy tips for IEP meetings. So the first section is tips to prepare for the IEP meeting. I think in preparation, reviewing records is certainly something that I do, but reviewing the most recent IEP that you have, reviewing the progress notes, any other information that's come home. Is there anything you've got concerns about? Taking notes on that so you can bring that up at the meeting. Is there anything you don't understand? So writing down a question that you have for the team for that meeting. Requesting a copy of a draft IEP before the IEP meeting if available. So in South Carolina, some districts do this, and as long as it's a draft and changes can be made to it, that's okay because it's a draft. I think this is something that can give insight into proposals that are going to be made. It gives parents time to really review those proposals, to be able to prepare their input, prepare questions, make notes on this. I will say that in my research on this, there are varying thoughts on draft IEPs. For instance, some of the things I read talked about the concern of impacting discussion. And I think there's probably pros and cons both ways, but you know, in my experiences, I think this can be useful if it is used correctly. So if your district does do that, you can certainly ask if you get a copy of it. Being prepared and being organized, I think these go hand in hand. Having a notebook or file where you can take notes to help you prepare for the meeting, things that you want to make sure you ask at the team. I mean, I think we all know how sometimes these meetings can go into tangents. So I think keeping a list of things that you want to discuss at the IEP meeting can really help you stay on task. I think the other thing is finding out if there's areas that you've got concerns and approaching the district so they can be prepared to discuss that at the meeting. For instance, if you've got a concern about speech language services, letting the district know that so they can either prepare to have information available for you at the IEP meeting or have that speech professional there so you can get that information that you're concerned about. Take notes to bring into the IEP meeting. That really goes to what we just talked about. It will help you stay on task. Asking if the district does an agenda so you can request that items be put onto that agenda if you've got any concerns you want discussed. And I think thinking, is there any information that you have that you want to share at the IEP meeting? For instance, for requests that you want to make. For instance, if your student isn't able to regulate body temperature and you're going to make a request for a climate controlled bus, you know, is there medical documentation that you have about the disability, about that need that you can share in anticipation of making that request? Any kind of outside evaluations from private providers that may have recommendations for the team or private provider information or recommendations. Just remember that IEP teams must consider this information, but ultimately don't have to follow this information. All right, next slide.
I'm going to add quickly that the request of the draft IEP, I even, you know, when I talked with Amanda the other day, I said, you know, I think a lot of us, including myself over the years, have had our school districts say no. And so you can even ask for the agenda in advance, but if you don't get anything in advance and you show up to the IEP meeting and you feel like this is a whole new document, there's been so much changed, don't hesitate to say that, to express that concern that you're really struggling to keep up because there's so many changes and you really need their help to identify what they have changed and what is new.
Mm-hmm.
And I can share with you that my state education department did support that my team needed to do that. That team should make sure that it's very clear what is new at each IEP meeting in that document. And one tip that I do have regarding being organized is I started always having a notebook piece of paper separate that said PWN prior written notice. And throughout the meeting, I could just keep a bulleted list of what needed to make sure it made its way onto that prior written notice by the end of the meeting.
Yes. And that actually is helpful for tips for the IEP meeting, which is perfect. Also, we're at the 1 hour mark. Is that okay to keep going? I don't have too much left. Okay, great.
No, you're
Thank
fine.
you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So tips for the IEP meeting. I mean, certainly the 4 Ps, preparation, politeness, patience, and persistence certainly apply here. It's going to apply throughout the entire process. Listen carefully and take notes. And this kind of goes to what Katie was talking about. And I actually do, I mean, I take my own notes at IEP meetings, but I also have a separate page for if something comes up during that meeting that I've got a question about that I want to make sure we come back to. I have a separate page where I mark that off and I make sure that we get to that before we end the meeting. But I think listen to the position of the other side and make sure that you fully understand that position. So if you've got concerns about it, ask those questions, making sure that you understand so you can provide that effective input. That really goes back to the parent participation discussion that we had. If you have a concern, ask questions to get better clarification. One of the reasons I suggest taking notes is what Katie just said, comparing that to the prior written notice that you get. Is that prior written notice aligning with your understanding of the meeting and what occurred, what decisions were made, what the basis of was for it, what the outcome, were there any other things that were discussed? If your notes and prior written notice don't align, those are things that you can address with the district. You can ask for revisions of the prior written notice. Some districts take meeting minutes, ask to review them for accuracy at the meeting, if possible. Take breaths and request a break. I think ask questions too, but we really talked in depth, just I think about the importance of asking questions, but really, especially at the IEP meeting. For instance, suppose the district's going to implement a new plan. Let's say it's a behavioral intervention plan, which is going to have interventions. It's going to talk about what's going to do if the student is having a behavior of concern, and it's a brand new plan. I think making sure you understand who's going to implement that plan. What kind of data is going to be kept on that plan? And I can't emphasize data enough. Data is going to let you know if interventions are working and are effective. So keeping the data on that plan. When is there going to be a follow-up meeting on that plan to discuss the effectiveness of those interventions? Do tweaks need to be made? So asking questions like that if that's not discussed at the meeting, especially if there's something to be followed up on. Taking a deep break and requesting a break if needed. And this really goes back to what we just discussed about being aware of your emotions. The same applies in IEP meetings. Sometimes meetings can get heated. Try not to let this happen to a meeting if you can help it. Really think through some strategies that will work for you. Taking a break. That's certainly something that we do in meetings. My parents and I, we have a key phrase, or they tap me. We discuss this before the meeting about when we need to just ask to take a break, step outside, really get our thoughts together and how we're going to respond to something that there are concerns about. Getting a drink of water, getting some air, calling a resource. For instance, if you've got an advocate helping you, calling that person if they're not there, saying, this just happened, what should I do? And kind of getting some feedback on that. Watch your behavior in the meeting. This can really take the focus off the child and really derail a meeting. And you really want the IEP meeting to always be focused on the student, not on the behavior, not on accusations, things of that nature. And finally, don't let it get personal. Personal attacks, I've really seen those derail meetings. So really try to be careful of that as well. Parents may not agree with the rest of the IEP team and vice versa. So it is possible that you may not come to an agreement at the IEP meeting. I often have to tell parents that you do not have veto power in a meeting. So after discussion, it is possible that a district may still go forward with their proposal, even if a parent has concerns about that. The way IDA works is parents have rights outside of the meeting to be able to address concerns like that. But I think we're going to talk about strategies on the next slide. I think there are things that you can also do to try to address concerns if you've got them after a meeting. If there is a disagreement, perhaps strategy during the meeting could be talking, if you've got a special ed director or a coordinator in that meeting with you, asking to step out and having a one-on-one with that person just to kind of relay all your concerns, kind of getting some feedback on that. You can certainly ask for a meeting to be adjourned. They may or may not do that, but that's something you could request if you'd like some more time, especially if you have a reason. If you say, I'd really like to get some more information, and maybe can we adjourn this meeting and come back another time when I've got some more information that we can discuss. Subsequent to the meeting, make sure you get all meeting documents, including that prior written notice, because as Katie and I have both mentioned, it's a very important document, and that's the one you want to check. And finally, do not leave a meeting before it is over. So if they're not going to adjourn that meeting, sit there. And the reason I say that is because they can continue going forward with that meeting and make decisions without you. And you don't want decisions being made without you hearing what's being discussed about that. All right.
And I know you may say this somewhere else, but that's also important for all team members as well. I know that it's happened many times in our meetings where it goes on longer than we anticipated and somebody needs to leave. And they should be looking and getting permission and making sure that it's okay that they leave.
That's right.
So while we want to make sure that we're not leaving so that they don't continue to make decisions without our input, if you need the input of that team member who's leaving, you can raise that concern that I really need this person at the table. Everybody should be present that has input on the matters that are being discussed. So all team members should be there if you feel they should, and it needs to be raised if they're not. And then I just want to add to the deep breath. If you did the webinar on self-care, which I know a lot of people are starting to just like that term, you really learn though on that webinar the importance of that deep breath and the actual effects that it can have on your body and how much it really helps. Amanda has seen it. She has sat beside me many times in meetings. I literally write a symbol on my hand that reminds me to take that breath. Because if you know me, which I think everyone does, the emotion part was very hard for me. I've got the persistence, I've got the preparation, but especially that emotion part, being polite when my child's not getting what he needs and what he has a right to, it's very frustrating. And know that we know this and we recognize this.
Absolutely.
So we're not saying lightly to just be polite. It really is a strategic move.
Right.
And it's
and that's
very helpful. And we have actually stepped out and taken breaks. I've had a symbol on my hand reminding myself to take that break and to breathe. There's a few other reminders through symbols that I've done. Find something that works for you to help you do this. It will be beneficial. And we've also stepped out before when I had just one team member that I was just really butting heads with, and it wasn't productive anymore. And Amanda was the one who requested for us to go and have a separate meeting with the district, just so it wasn't taking place. And I realized afterwards that was just really respectful overall to not be, I was going to appear that I was bashing one specific individual. And so that wasn't going to be productive for anyone.
Absolutely. Those are some great tips. So what if there are still concerns? And these are just some tips and techniques to try to follow up on concerns to address it. So you've heard us now talk about prior written notice on a few slides, and I'm just going to reiterate again, this gives you details about the meeting. Follow up with the district if you're not getting it, if it's incomplete, or you feel that it doesn't reflect what occurred at the meeting or decision that was made. Contacting the school district special education department. This is one that we often suggest to parents when they first contacted us. So that means talking to the special ed director or coordinator over the school district, over that school. And really, it gives you the opportunity to have a conversation, a one-on-one. Sometimes it's a lot easier to talk when you're not in a group setting. Katie just talked about her experience in stepping away from a meeting to talk to special ed department and how that really helped the situation. I think keep in mind that sometimes the school district special education department may not be aware of concerns that are occurring. For instance, if a school district's calling a parent to pick up a child frequently, if a child isn't receiving the services that they should be getting, just by notifying them, they can follow up, and sometimes that can fix a problem. And I think, again, document any important conversations that you have if you do have a contact. So for instance, dear special ed director, thank you so much for our call today. I raised the concern about my student being being called frequently by the school to pick up my child. I understand that you're going to look into this and that we are then going to have an IEP meeting to discuss it or whatever was discussed. I look forward to hearing from you by this date. Sincerely. A nice email that just documents that conversation that you had and what your understanding of the follow-up was going to be. Requesting a subsequent IEP meeting. So this is another IEP meeting after gathering more information or data to review progress. And this can be helpful if there's a new intervention being tried. You know, you just heard me talk about the intervener matter where more information was gathered to approach the team with, and that helped to persuade the team that this was an important service the student needed. If new information has arisen on your end, like new information in the medical field, documentation about the disability, that can be shared with the school district as well. Requesting an evaluation. This would be an evaluation through the school district. So if more information is needed about academic or functional performance or needs or strengths, for instance, if there's a regression, why is there that regression? Sometimes an evaluation can help give the team data to consider that. All right, next slide.
I just want to add too, on the subsequent IEP meetings, I noticed that a lot of families that I've spoken to over the years tend to only have that one annual IEP. And I know we didn't even touch this subject tonight because there are so many different topics that you can talk about. But if you only have that one a year and it's falling in November, I just want to mention that, you know, ESY services, are they making a decision at that time? Or are they deferring it to the spring? So if you notice, sometimes that section can get skipped over pretty quick. So if you're just having that one, you know, IEP meeting and it's happening in October or November, make sure that it's noted that you need to, you know, defer to this, you know, to a later meeting, that we need to reconvene maybe in April to discuss the extended school year services to see if this child, you know, the student needs to have them in the next summer. You know, October and November is really a difficult time to determine that.
Absolutely, and that's just so important because you're right. IDEA requires at least one annual meeting a year. That being said, a district can call a meeting, the parent can request a meeting. If any concerns arise, if there's any issues that are going to come up, problems with a service. So do keep that in mind that you all can request a meeting too. This is going to be the last slide in this section, tips if there are still concerns continued. Requesting, so we talked about evaluations through the school district at the end of the last slide. This is requesting an independent educational evaluation. It's also known as the acronym IEE. And I'm going to talk about two types. So really an independent evaluation is going to give outside information that may be helpful to you and the team as far as providing informed decisions and planning. They're conducted by an independent qualified examiner. It would be somebody who's not connected to the school district. So I think two types. A parent can obtain an IE at their own expense. This can be done at any time. It can be any evaluation that you feel would be helpful. It really provides you outside input from a professional like a doctor or a psychologist. And keep in mind that you can invite individuals who are familiar with your child to IEP meetings. So if you have an outside expert or professional that you feel might give that team some helpful information, you can bring in an evaluation. You can invite that person to participate. I've had professionals call into meetings, come in person, Skype in. So it can really vary depending on the person. But that's just another way to provide input into this process. The other IE is what's called an independent educational evaluation at public expense. And parents can request this from a school district if you disagree with a school district evaluation. So once the parent requests it, the school district either has to provide the IE at public expense, or it can request due process to show that their evaluation was appropriate. There's only going to be one IE each time there's a district evaluation, but I've seen them for full evaluations, for transition evaluations, speech, functional behavioral assessments. It can really vary. If a parent does request this, then the district must provide information on where to obtain an IEE and the criteria that it uses for its evaluations. I strongly suggest if you're going to be doing this to talk with the district about your request and what its response to it before you pursue it. You don't want to go remake this request, then go out, pursue it, and the district says, oh, I don't think it's needed, and you've already got someone working on that. Because I think the key is you want to make sure they're going to do it and pay for it. For both, the team has to consider the results, but it doesn't have to follow any recommendations in those. Finally, becoming familiar with the resources in your state. We talked about PTIs. We talked about the protection and advocacy system. I've got the website links at the end in the resource sections. And finally, my last tip is become familiar with the informal and formal dispute options in your state or U.S. territory, and dispute resolution in IDEA. So dispute resolution in IDEA, that's mediation, the complaint process, and due process. Each state may have some options too. So for instance, in South Carolina, we've got some informal options. We have within our Department of Education's Office of Special Education Service a BUDS person that parents could call with questions or concerns and talk to that person. We have a process called facilitated IEPs, which is a free and voluntary option to parents in our state, which can be really useful when communication has come down. It's a free process through our State Department of Ed, where they train and provide facilitators to teams that make that request, and that individual goes to the meeting. They're not a member of the IEP team, but they help that team through that process. So I strongly encourage you to become familiar. In our state's Department of Ed's Office of Special Education Services has a parent resources website that's got a lot more information on it, including the different kind of options. So that may be a place to check too. All right, so we're going to finish this up with going to some general resources.
Can I add about the concern? I don't know that we shared about the concern area where parent input can be placed directly onto the IEP itself, and how important that can be later on to show that you have continually expressed concerns that you feel have not been resolved.
Sure. So in South Carolina, the program that where I think almost all, if not the bulk majority of districts use, is a program that has a section for parental input. And I think that's helpful because it really gives parents an opportunity in that meeting. I mean, you certainly have the opportunity throughout the meeting to provide your input, but it's just an extra way that it's tailored in this particular IEP system to be able to enable parents to put that input right in the IEP.
And I've looked at other states, and I know they're going to differ, but if you look, sometimes I believe even North Carolina, it's just worded a little differently. There's usually an area you can get your input documented on there.
All right, so resources. So on the first slide for general resources, if you go to the next one, it's going to be the link I gave you earlier about finding your protection and advocacy system. And like I said, that enables you to see if they do educational services. P&As do a lot more than that. So I definitely strongly encourage you to become familiar with your P&A system and what they do. Right underneath that, finding your state's parent training and information center. I've given you a couple websites for that. And if we go to the next slide.
And I can share these in the event area and also in some other areas for our parents.
Perfect, thank you. This one is an interesting one, IDEA, Building the Legacy of IDEA. This one's got a lot of information on it. It's got resources, letters from the Department of Ed, guidance from our U.S. Department of Ed. So I just thought that would be an interesting one and helpful to share with you. The Center for Parent Information and Resources has a lot of information, and I can tell you most parents are familiar with rights law. Usually when I provide that information, the majority have been to that page, but if you haven't, here is the rights law website. It's got a ton of information on it, including the second website link I provided, which is their advocacy page, and that's got even more tips and information on advocacy if you have an interest in just learning more about this area. And again, check your Department of Ed web page. Like I said, ours has a page specific to parent resources, and yours might as well, so it wouldn't hurt to check on that.
And I have to joke and say that the rights law, I went to one of the conferences that you mentioned earlier, and when the presenter said on the stage, "Are there any parents in the room today?" And a few of us raised our hands, he held this book up, From Emotions to Advocacy, and he literally said, "You need to read this, and then you need to read it again." So the emotions really can actually, they can be a great motivation to keep us going with our advocacy, but they can hurt us at the same time.
Absolutely. All right, and the last slide, there's my email in case you want to reach out to me directly. I've given you the contact information for our central office, and that's going to be in Columbia, South Carolina. I work out of our Charleston office, and I just want to say, I know we went a little bit over, so I certainly appreciate that with you all, and it's just been a pleasure talking with you, and I really hope you found this helpful. again, please let me know if you have any questions. That's my work email address. Please feel free to reach out to me, reach out to Katie. She will share those questions with me, and we'll certainly get back in touch with you if you have any. Also, Katie's going to be sharing a link to a survey about this presentation. I'd really appreciate it if you have a little bit of time, if you could just fill that out to let me know about your feedback on this presentation. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you everyone for sticking with us and joining us tonight. I just added the link to the survey on the chat area. It has been there since the beginning, so it's at the top and now it's at the bottom. I'm also going to post that in the GFPD parent group, as well as, you're welcome, Emily. And we're also going to post that in the parent group. I'm going to post some of the slides in there. If you're not part of the GFPD parent group and you participated tonight and you have any questions, you want the slides, or you need the link for some reason you can't access it through the chat box tonight, my email is Katie, K-A-T-I-E, @thegfpd.org. And again, that's Katie @thegfpd.org. And I can connect you to Amanda if you're needing to see the slides. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And remember that, you know, what, like she said, P&A, there's a different, there's places in your states as well, and they do more than education. Education was just one area that we talked about tonight. And speaking of, next month in October, we're going to have another webinar about advocacy with a lobbyist that's going to be in an entirely different area. I know how overwhelming all the advocacy work can be. If your child has PBD, like I believe most of the families on here tonight, then you know that we are advocating in so many different areas simultaneously, and education is just one huge piece of it. So I really hope that tonight you walk away feeling empowered, and you are able to take pieces of this, if not all of it, and apply it, and really just feel more empowered and know that you are going to advocate for your child better than you were, which I know was already huge, because all the parents I know are just advocating at a level that's here, and it's so impressive to me. But I know that I've been doing this since TJ was 3, he's 19, and I'm always learning something. So I hope that tonight you've learned something too. And we're going to go ahead and finish out. And again, please fill out that survey. That information is going to go directly to Amanda at P&A. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And again, if you guys post your questions to me or to her, we will follow up and get back to you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.